This is Aleppo, or what it was in peacetime. It used to be the most affluent city in Syria. Prior to the outbreak of war and instability, it was a peaceful and harmonious city where children played, learned, and lived in peace with their families. This is what it looks like today. Nowadays, it's a battleground between the government and rebel forces. Aleppo was chosen as the center stage of the Syrian war because of its significance in terms of infrastructure and the country's economy. I'll first give a brief outline to the situation in Aleppo and move on to human rights violations, then what the implications are for the obligations of the international community and whether they did all they could for the people in Aleppo. Aleppo became the main stage in the Syrian war after rebel forces took hold of the city from the Assad regime in 2012. The sources of conflict in this war come from multiple sources, however they can be separated into two categories: the Syria-Russia alliance and the collective rebel groups. Currently, Aleppo is split into east and west. The east is being held by the rebels and the west has been reclaimed by the Assad regime. War crimes have been and continue to be committed by both sides in this conflict. Aerial bombs, air-to-surface rockets, cluster munitions, incendiary bombs, barrel bombs, and weapons delivering toxic industrial chemicals have been used by the Syrian-Russian alliance to indiscriminately inflict damage on densely populated pockets of eastern Aleppo. At the same time, rebel groups shell and fire indiscriminately in western Aleppo with no clear target. It's also very difficult for those in eastern Aleppo to leave because they may be detained and killed under suspicions of involvement in rebel activities, and the route out of Aleppo itself is a very dangerous one. Even though many have fled, it's impossible now for all citizens to be evacuated. In December of last year, a temporary ceasefire was negotiated by various parties of the two sides to provide a small window of opportunity for evacuation. However, that peace was disrupted when buses along evacuation routes were targeted and bombed. A lot of civilians also refused to leave the city because they are afraid of what the government forces will do to them. The international community has an obligation to protect the rights of the people in Aleppo because of its promise to prevent further mass atrocities. It's difficult to determine who is on the right side of the war in this case, but the certain thing is that large numbers of the Syrian population have been killed. Aleppo will be the world's legacy. Unfortunately, because it is such a complex situation, it's hard to intervene without worsening it. Therefore, I'm going to focus more on the international obligation of providing aid. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights lists the basic rights that any person should receive simply for being human. While the Syrian war has violated so many of those rights for the people in Aleppo, the ones that are the most significant to the international aid community are the following. Article 3, right to life, liberty and security of person. The residents in Aleppo, more particularly in the eastern rebel-held regions, are subject to constant aerial bombardment of more populated areas, sieges after a takeover, and house-by-house raids, and families are shot dead in their homes. Children are exposed to violence and live in fear of being bombed, either killing them or leaving them completely alone in the world without their families. Article 25, right to standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, housing, clothing, and medical care. The Doctors Without Borders organization had set up a hospital in Aleppo in 2012, but couldn't get official approval to build any in the government-held regions. As the war worsened, they could only set up bases in dangerous rebel-held areas. Providing health services eventually came to be seen as acts of resistance, and that's when medical structures became military targets. Hospitals are running on generators, which needs difficult to acquire fuel, and drug supplies are exhausted. The official supply routes for medicine have become impossible, and the only way to get medicine in now is through unofficial routes into the city. No hospitals exist in eastern Aleppo. Routes in and out of the city, as well as densely populated areas in eastern Aleppo, are targeted in aerial attacks and bombs planted in obscure locations on the street. Essentials like food, housing and medical care are unavailable to the people. An aid convoy carrying food that would have supplied decent food to 25% of the residents in Aleppo was blown apart. Through official means, it would be difficult to provide aid because of the sensitive nature of the logistics. The UN was able to negotiate with the Assad regime to guarantee that the Castello route would be open for safe passages to humanitarian aid workers and supplies. Unfortunately, the people in eastern Aleppo protested against receiving aid from the UN via the Castello route due to the belief that it would delegitimize the revolt and prevent their recapture of the route. Instead, they are looking for humanitarian aid from the rebels via the Ramusa route. They don't appreciate the government's hypocrisy in starving the people of their basic needs and bombing them and then providing them with aid. Given the conditions that were imposed on official organizations like the UN and Doctors Without Borders, the international community was very limited in what they could do for the people in Aleppo. The Assad regime refuses to allow official medical aid into the city or guarantee the safety of the people's homes, and UN negotiations are difficult because of the multifaceted nature of the conflict. Routes into the city are rife with danger, and rebel forces refuse help from the source of their misery in fear that the Assad regime will use that as a point of contention. Under these conditions, official international aid organizations have done what they could to fulfill their obligations. However, there is one alternative that the international community has not yet tried. Rather than providing covert aid to Syrian opposition forces in the form of access to arms and artillery training as America had done in 2011, coalitions of the obligated may have been formed to covertly provide areas in Aleppo with items necessary to sustain life, such as food, water, and medical supplies. They could also provide safe passage out of war zones or provide asylum to those fleeing prosecution. Having said that, while the coalitions may be able to provide aid to the civilians, there are many dangers and barriers to overcome, such as finding a safe route into Aleppo and having adequate training.